Welcome back. Picture a Tuesday morning in October of 1881, and the sun is only just clearing the Dragoon Mountains to the east, throwing long orange light down Allen Street. A freight wagon creaks past, its wheels cutting fresh ruts into dust that has not yet been turned to mud by the summer monsoons. A butcher is dragging open the shutters of his shop. Somewhere behind a saloon door, a piano is being tuned, one note struck over and over until it sits right. Men in canvas coats are already walking toward the mines with lunch pails swinging at their sides, and nobody on that street has any idea that within a few hours, this ordinary morning will become one of the most talked about mornings in American history. Using AI reconstruction, restored photographs, and the accounts of people who were actually standing on these boardwalks, we are going to walk through Tombstone, Arizona exactly as it looked in 1881, before the legend, before the movies, when it was simply a booming, dusty, dangerous, and remarkably ordinary town trying to get through another day. And by the end of this journey, you will also see exactly what remains standing on these same blocks right now, in the present day. To understand Tombstone in 1881, you first have to understand that almost nothing had existed there only 3 years earlier. In 1877, a prospector named Ed Schieffelin set out into the hills near the San Pedro River, in country so dangerous with Apache resistance that soldiers at a nearby camp reportedly told him the only thing he would find out there was his own tombstone. He found silver instead, and in a small act of dark humor, he named his claim exactly what he had been warned about. Within 2 years, that joke of a name had become a real town, spreading across a flat mesa at about 4,500 feet in elevation, surrounded by scrub, mesquite, and rock. The earliest structures were nothing like the town people picture today. They were canvas tents, plank shacks, and hastily built adobe rooms, thrown up so quickly that streets were laid out almost as an afterthought once the tents had already claimed the ground. Water had to be hauled in by wagon from miles away, since the mesa itself sat dry above the water table, and that single detail, the simple lack of water, would end up shaping and eventually limiting nearly everything the town became. The earliest residents, mostly miners, gamblers, and merchants chasing the silver rush, had no reason to believe they were building anything permanent. They were building a camp. They had no way of knowing that this same dusty mesa would become permanently fixed in American memory. By 1881, that camp had exploded into something almost unrecognizable from its tent city beginnings. Tombstone's population is believed to have reached somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people, an astonishing number for a settlement barely 4 years old, sitting in the middle of the Arizona desert. Allen Street, the town's main commercial spine, was lined with false-fronted wooden buildings standing shoulder to shoulder, their painted signs advertising assay offices, dry goods stores, dentists, and no fewer than 24 saloons within a few blocks. The Grand Hotel rose 2 stories above the street, boasting gas lighting, carpeted hallways, and a dining room that served oysters shipped in on ice. A genuine luxury in a desert town accessible only by stagecoach and freight wagon. Beneath the streets themselves, the real engine of the town ran day and night. The mines. Shafts like the Tough Nut and the Contention drove hundreds of feet down into the earth, and the ore they pulled up was processed at nearby stamp mills, whose pounding machinery was said to be audible from town at almost any hour. This was not a finished place. Buildings were still going up on nearly every block, wooden sidewalks were being extended street by street, and just months earlier, in June of 1881, a fire had torn through a significant portion of the business district, destroying dozens of buildings that were, even by October, still being hastily rebuilt in the very same spots. Tombstone in 1881 was not a museum piece frozen in dignity. It was raw, unfinished, and constantly being patched, rebuilt, and argued over even as it thrived. Civic and legal order in Tombstone existed, but it existed in an uneasy, overlapping tangle. The town had its own municipal government and a town marshal, while surrounding Cochise County had an elected sheriff, and the two jurisdictions did not always agree on who was in charge or whose authority mattered more. Court sessions were held in a modest building where mining disputes, over claims worth genuine fortunes, were argued as fiercely as any criminal case, since a poorly worded claim filing could turn a rich man penniless overnight. Political tension ran through the town as well, largely dividing along lines of business interests aligned with the Earp family and their allies, against ranching and outlying interests aligned with a loose group of cowboys operating in the surrounding county. This was not simply lawmen against outlaws in any simple sense. It was a struggling frontier economy where mining money, cattle money, and gambling money all competed for control of the same streets, the same offices, and the same law. Ordinary daily life in Tombstone had its own rhythm, one shaped by heat, dust, and constant noise. Miners worked shifts around the clock, since the mines never closed, meaning the town itself rarely fully slept. Chinese immigrants operated laundries and restaurants along a section of the town sometimes called Hoptown, while Mexican, Irish, and Anglo-American residents lived and worked in close, crowded proximity, each community holding on to its own food, language, and customs even while sharing the same dusty streets. Meals were heavy on beef, beans, and whatever vegetables could survive the journey in by wagon, while fresh produce was expensive enough to be something of a status symbol. Entertainment ranged from respectable theater performances to the rougher pleasures of faro tables and cockfights, and newspapers like the Tombstone Epitaph and the Rival Nugget did not merely report the news. They actively took sides in the town's political and personal feuds, printing accusations that today would likely invite a lawsuit. Graffiti, tally marks, and hand-carved names have been found on surviving structural timbers, small, human traces left by workers who never imagined anyone would study them more than a century later. If there was one place that captured the spectacle and communal identity of the town, it was the Birdcage Theater, which opened in December of 1881 and quickly became known for hosting everything from traveling stage productions to boxing exhibitions to all-night card games in curtained box seats suspended along its upper walls, the very bird cages that gave the venue its name. The New York Times reportedly once called it the wildest, wickedest night spot between Basin Street and the Barbary Coast, and whether or not every claim made about the venue was strictly accurate, it undeniably functioned as the emotional center of the town's nightlife, a single roof under which miners, gamblers, actors, and gunfighters all crossed paths on the same evening. On the other end of the social spectrum stood the private world of Tombstone's wealthier residents. Men who had turned silver into genuine fortunes. Figures connected to the mining companies built comfortable homes furnished with imported furniture, fine china, and in some cases pianos hauled in at enormous expense over rough desert roads. These homes stood in visible, almost defiant contrast to the tents and shacks only blocks away, a physical reminder of just how quickly fortunes could be made in a boomtown. And yet, whatever protection that wealth seemed to offer, it would prove no shield at all against what silver mining itself was quietly doing to the ground beneath the entire town, a vulnerability that made no distinction between a mine owner's parlor and a miner's tent. The turning point most people associate with Tombstone did not happen underground at all, though it is often remembered as though the whole town revolved around it. On the afternoon of October 26, 1881, in a vacant lot near the OK Corral, a confrontation between the Earp brothers, Doc Holliday, and members of the Clanton and McClory families erupted into gunfire that lasted only about 30 seconds. In that brief span, roughly 30 shots were fired at close range, and 3 men lay dead. In the moment, witnesses along Fremont Street reportedly believed they were hearing nothing more than another round of the town's frequent gunfire, so common that it barely registered until the silence afterward made clear something serious had happened. What actually unfolded was the culmination of months of tension between two factions competing for control of Tombstone's law, money, and reputation, and its aftermath, including inquests, further shootings, and lasting animosity, would occupy the town's newspapers for months to come. But the deeper and quieter disaster facing Tombstone was already underway even as that gunfight became legend. The mines that fed the entire town were beginning to flood. By the mid-1880s, underground water had become such a persistent problem that enormous pumps had to be installed just to keep the shafts workable, and when a fire in 1886 destroyed the pumping works themselves, the mines flooded for good. The silver that had built Tombstone in under 4 years began pulling the town back down in barely more time than that. In the years that followed, Tombstone's population drained away almost as quickly as it had arrived. Miners moved on to new strikes elsewhere, businesses closed their doors, and buildings that had gone up in frantic haste were simply abandoned, left to the wind and the slow work of decay. For a time, Tombstone nearly lost its status as county seat altogether, and much of its early written history existed only in fading newspaper archives and the fragmented memories of people who had lived through its boom. The town did not vanish completely, A small population held on through the lean decades, but the roaring boomtown of 1881 quietly slipped into myth long before historians and preservationists began taking a serious interest in separating its real history from its growing legend. That serious rediscovery began in earnest in the 20th century, as historians and later the National Park Service and the state of Arizona began combing through surviving structures, court records, and newspaper archives to piece together what daily life had actually been like, apart from the dramatized versions already spreading through books and film. Restoration efforts on buildings like the Bird Cage Theater revealed original fixtures, gaming equipment, and even personal items left behind by patrons decades earlier, remarkably preserved in the dry desert air. What surprised many researchers was not the violence, which had already been endlessly retold, but the ordinariness underneath it, the ledgers, laundry lists, and shopkeeper accounts that showed a town far more occupied with silver prices and rent than with legend. It is worth pausing here simply to remember that Tombstone was, before anything else, somebody's home. Behind every gunfight retold in film and every dusty photograph lies a butcher opening his shop, a mother raising children in a canvas tent, a miner descending into darkness for another 10-hour shift. These were real people building real lives in an unforgiving place, and it is worth holding onto their humanity, not just their legend. Today, you can walk that same stretch of Allen Street, and much of it remains startlingly recognizable. The Bird Cage Theater still stands, now a museum, its original bar, stage, and even bullet holes preserved largely as they were left in the 1880s. The OK Corral site has been preserved as a historic landmark, with markers showing where that 30-second gunfight actually took place, drawing visitors from around the world who stand in that same vacant lot. The Tombstone Courthouse, built in 1882, now operates as a state historic park, housing artifacts, photographs, and records from the town's boom years. Many of the false-fronted buildings along the main streets have been restored and now house shops and museums rather than assay offices and saloons, though a few original saloons do still pour drinks in the very rooms where miners once did. The mines themselves, flooded and largely inactive since the 1880s, remain mostly closed to the public, silent reminders of the water that both built and unmade the town's fortune. Thank you so much for walking through Tombstone with me today. If you enjoyed seeing this desert boomtown brought back to life, let me know in the comments, and tell me which lost town or vanished city you would like to see reconstructed next. Your suggestions genuinely shape where this channel goes, so keep them coming, and I will see you in the next one.